Hello, and welcome to today's episode, which is an overview of print media in India. The content for this episode has been researched by Sunil Saxena, who is an author and journalist with over 3 decades of experience in print, new media, social media, media education, and media research. In this episode, you will learn about the initial years of print media in India that dates back to the 18th century. You will learn how the print media evolved in different Indian languages, how the nationalist press rose to counter the Anglo-Indian press, how the nationalist media played an important role in the freedom struggle, how the print media grew in post-independent India. You will also learn about the dramatic change that occurred in the shape, size, structure, and reach of the print media after the emergency and the reasons for this change. You will also learn how the print media is coping with the challenge posed by the arrival of internet in India. The first newspaper. The first newspaper in India was published on January 29, 1780 by James Augustus Hickey. The weekly paper titled Bengal Gazette or Calcutta General Advertiser was published from Calcutta. The paper, also called Hickey's Gazette, bravely described itself as a weekly political and commercial paper open to all, but influenced by none. However, the paper was shut down within 2 years following sharp clashes with Governor General Warren Hastings and the then Chief Justice. The next few years saw 3 more papers being launched from Calcutta. These papers were the Indian Gazette, Calcutta Gazette, and Bengal Journal. The next Indian city to get a newspaper was Madras. The Madras Courier was started in 1785. 10 years later, in 1795, Madras Gazette was born. Bombay got its first paper in 1789 with the start of Bombay Herald. This paper did not last long. It merged with Bombay Gazette, which was launched in 1791. All these papers were set up by British nationals, had low circulation, and did not survive for long. Print media in 19th century. The early 19th century saw the emergence of Indian language newspapers. The pioneers were the Serampore missionaries who started Samachar Darpan, and Raja Ram Mohan Roy, a social reformer, who tried to give a new dimension to print media in India. He launched 3 papers in 3 languages: Sambad Comedy in Bengali in 1821, Miratul Akhbar in Persian in 1822, and Brahmanical Magazine in English in 1822. The focus of his publications was social reform. It was in the second half of the 19th century that some of the major nationalist and British newspapers were born. In 1861, 3 newspapers, the Standard, the Bombay Times, and Telegraph, were merged to create the Times of India. The owner of the Times of India, Mr. Robert Knight, also went on to set up the Statesman in Calcutta in 1875. A third major British newspaper to be set up at this time was the Pioneer. The newspaper, which began publication from Allahabad, came to be served by the legendary Rudyard Kipling. These three newspapers were very loyal to the British interests and were popularly referred to as Anglo-Indian newspapers during the freedom struggle. In 1868, the first great Indian nationalist newspaper, Amrit Bazar Patrika, was established. It was followed by the Hindu, which was established 10 years later in Madras. Two other strong nationalist papers to come up in this period were Kesari in Marathi and the Maratha in English. Both were set up by the veteran freedom fighter Bal Gangadhar Tilak. In Kerala, the Malayalam Manorama began publication in 1890. All these newspapers were weekly papers when they started. First half of 20th century. There was a sharp upsurge of patriotic fervor in the 20th century as the freedom movement gained momentum. This was also reflected on the pages of nationalist newspapers that were either set up by eminent Indians or came to be edited by leading lights of the freedom movement. In 1900, Bengali began publication in English under the editorship of Surendranath Banerjee. In 1901, Bipin Chandra Pal launched The New India in English and Bande Mataram in Bengali. In 1906, Barendra Kumar Ghosh launched Yugantar in Bengali. In 1909, Madan Mohan Malviya set up Leader. Leading names came to be associated with the nationalist newspapers. The most eminent among them, of course, was Mahatma Gandhi, who edited Young India and Navjeevan. Later, he also started editing Harijan. All these publications became important vehicles of freedom movement. The national thought was influenced greatly by the writings of these eminent Indians. In 1924, yet another nationalist paper, the Hindustan Times, came into existence in New Delhi. And in 1938, Jawaharlal Nehru set up National Herald in Lucknow. Second half of 20th century, the history of the print media in post-independence India can be divided into two clear sections: pre-emergency and post-emergency. The pre-emergency era was a quiet era. It can also be said to be an era of transformation and stagnation. The print media, after independence, reoriented itself to reporting day-to-day events about ministers, officials, policies, and government functions. The loftiness and idealism that characterized the journalism of pre-independence era was replaced with more nuts and bolts reporting. Some of the major events that the print media covered during this period were the first national elections of 1951-52, the formation of the linguistic states, the Chinese attack, and the takeover of Goa. These were not easy years for the print media. The honeymoon between the government and the media soured soon after the heady days of independence. The economy was still to come into its own, and most of the newspaper income came from government advertising. The salaries were low, and the newspaper hierarchy was ill defined. The profession that had attracted titans during the freedom struggle found it difficult to attract fresh talent. The government appointed the Press Commission in 1952 to review the working of the press and to suggest measures to strengthen it. The Press Commission gave its report in 1954. After that, the government passed the Working Journalists Act in 1955, the Newspaper Price and Page Act in 1956, and set up the Press Council in 1965. The emergency years. In June 1975, the then government, headed by Mrs. Indira Gandhi, declared a state of emergency. Civil rights were suspended, opposition leaders were arrested, and the press was shackled. The emergency lasted for a period of 19 months, and during this period, all news was regulated by the government. The two newspapers that protested against the harsh measures, the Statesman and the Indian Express, suffered the wrath of the government. Government advertising, which was an important source of revenue at that time, was withdrawn to any newspaper that dared to raise its voice. The four news agencies that supplied content to the Indian newspapers were merged to create a single agency. This helped the government tighten its hold on the flow of information. A fear psychosis was also created by threatening arrests of dissenting publishers, editors, and their families. It was a dark period in the history of Indian press, and there was much relief when the emergency was lifted and a new government sworn in. The post-emergency era. The post-emergency period was one of growth and change for the print media in India. The growth stemmed from a rapid change of technology. The hot metal system that had been used to print newspapers for 200 years was phased out. In its place came the cold type system. Almost all newspapers, one by one, shifted to new technology. The change that began in the 80s continued into the 90s. But even before all newspapers could shift to the new technology, another revolutionary change happened. This was the introduction of desktop publishing in the 90s. The new technology had a dramatic impact on the livelihood of workers. Hundreds of workers had to be either reskilled or retrenched. A new workforce that was younger and more tech savvy came into existence. The 80s also witnessed another significant change in technology. This was the introduction of color printing. Another significant change was the sectioning of the newspaper. The newspaper was divided into two sections, the main newspaper and the city or metro pullout. But the most dramatic change was in reach. The new technology made it possible to transmit print-ready pages to distant places at little or no cost. The newspapers took full advantage of this technology to set up satellite editions in small towns and cities. The main beneficiaries of this technology were the vernacular papers. They rapidly scaled up their operations in the 1990s and the first decade of the new century. This led to a sharp increase in circulation and readership because the satellite editions could feed the information needs of people living in remote places. The liberalization of the economy in the 1990s and the increase in literacy rates fueled this expansion further. The increased literacy created new readers, while the liberalization of the economy brought in more advertising revenue. The expansion took two interesting routes. The English language newspapers were more circumspect in setting up satellite editions. Newspapers like the Times of India or the Hindustan Times chose state capitals or important metros to expand. The language editions, such as Dainik Jagran and Dainik Bhaskar in Hindi, or Dinathanti in Tamil, or Vijay Karnataka in Kannada, set up editions in small towns. The result was that the circulation of language newspapers boomed and they raced past the English language newspapers. The change was not limited to technology and the changing market dynamics. There was an equally dramatic change in the way news stories were visualized and presented. There was a new buzz in newsrooms, and there were a burst of investigative stories that had not been seen in the past. It was as if the Indian media had suddenly woken up to its new role of a watchdog. The government, both at the center and in the states, came under intense scrutiny. The print media became the toast of the country when it brought down the Antole government in Maharashtra, exposed the Bhagalpur blindings, and shocked the conscience of the nation by reporting the trafficking of women in the famous Kamla case. The period also witnessed the emergence of weekly and fortnightly news magazines as an important part of print media. So far, the magazine segment was dominated by general interest magazines. After Emergency, India Today, Sunday, and The Week created a special place for themselves. They introduced a new brand of journalism that was more in-depth and more investigative. They were smartly produced and created a big market for themselves. The 80s also saw the launch of two Sunday papers, the Sunday Observer and the Sunday Mail. However, their popularity did not last long. A very significant change was the transformation of the business newspapers. The Economic Times was the first to shift to pink newsprint. It was followed by Financial Express and Business Standard. The change was not limited to looks. It was much deeper. The focus of business journalism changed. Corporate reporting became an important part of business content. There was a concerted effort to make business news more interesting and relevant. The pink papers were not the only ones who led the change. A new genre of business magazines, such as Business Today and Business World, published on slick, glossy paper added to the coverage of business news. The arrival of the satellite television and the internet in the 90s increased the competition for mind space. There was a huge exodus of staff to dot-coms and to television channels in the late 19s. But the print media held its ground. Print media in 21st century. The changes unleashed by liberalization and new technology in the last quarter of the 20th century continued to power the growth of print media in the 21st century too. There were two brief hiccups. The first from 2001 to 2003 and the second from 2008 to 2010. Both were caused by an economic depression, and the print media too felt the pinch. However, what caught the attention of the world was the continued growth of print media in India. This was in sharp contrast to the experience of the Western world, where newspapers were rapidly losing circulation as more and more people were shifting to the internet to get their news. In contrast, the paid circulation of Indian newspapers increased from 38 million in 2006 to 48.3 million in 2012, according to figures provided by the Audit Bureau of Circulation. This was an impressive jump of over 26% in 6 years. A similar increase can be seen in readership figures. According to figures released by Indian Readership Survey, IRS, the readership of Indian newspapers grew from 296 million in 2006 to 340 million in 2012. The reason for this increase, according to media observers, was increasing literacy, which went up from 65% in 2001 to 71% in 2011. Another interesting trend has been the continued growth in the language segment. The English language newspapers have registered only a marginal increase in the 21st century, as against the language newspapers that have forged ahead. The readership of the number one news daily, Dainik Jagran, according to IRS figures released in the last quarter of 2012, was 16.3 million. In contrast, the readership of the Times of India, the largest selling English daily, was 7.6 million. Equally interesting is the fact that 9 out of the 10 Indian newspapers are language dailies. If one adds up the combined readership of the top 10 language dailies, as per the 2012 IRS figures, it comes to a staggering 130 million. As against this, the combined readership of the top 10 English newspapers in that quarter was a mere 20 million. Interestingly, the PricewaterhouseCoopers survey titled Indian Entertainment and Media Outlook 2013 forecasts that the Indian language newspaper market has far from peaked. The language newspapers, especially Hindi newspapers, are poised for further growth in the coming years. The magazines, however, are not doing so well. Their circulation has been gradually going down in the 21st century. This is true of both general interest and news magazines. This is a story of print media as of today. It is difficult to forecast as to what the future holds. However, what can be said with confidence is that the print media has been a vibrant and strong pillar of Indian democracy. The history of print media in India dates back to 1780, the year when James Augustus Hickey set up Bengal Gazette, India's first paper. It was a weekly paper that lasted 2 years or so. In the next 2 decades, weekly papers were started from Madras and Bombay, but these papers were short lived. There was much more activity in the next century. An important initiative was that of Raja Rammohn Roy, who set up 3 publications. The focus of his papers was social reform. The century also saw the emergence of Anglo-Indian newspapers and nationalist newspapers. The Anglo-Indian newspapers were owned by British nationals and covered events from the British point of view. The top 3 Anglo-Indian newspapers of that time were the Pioneer, the Times of India, and the Statesman. The nationalist papers were set up by patriotic Indians and they espoused the cause of freedom. They included papers like the Amrit Bazar Patrika, the Hindu, Malayalam Manorama, Bengali, New India, Kesari, and Maratha. The leading lights of the freedom struggle continued to be associated with the print media in the 20th century too. These included Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Madan Mohan Malviya, and many more. The post-independence years saw the print media try to reorganize itself as an industry. These years can be called as the staid or steady years for the print media. Then came the emergency in 1975 and the freedom of the press was curbed for 19 months. This period is often referred to as the dark days. However, the face of the print media changed once the emergency was lifted. There was a new energy in newsrooms. New publications were launched as the demand for information increased. The printing technology underwent a revolutionary change. It became possible for the print media to launch satellite editions. The reach of the media increased. With it, the circulation and readership soared. The growth has continued in the 21st century. The print media, especially the language newspapers, continues to grow. This is all that we have in today's episode. Thank you and see you soon with another informative episode. Goodbye.